Thank you so much. Okay, put your hands up again if you're a first timer. Yeah, okay, me too. Who was just not prepared for this? This was a vibe, wasn't it? I was really, it's very early and I'm very awake now. So that's good. A couple of things. So I feel like I'm slightly underdressed. I had some really like jazzy, what I would call disco earrings on this morning, but I was made to remove them because of my Britney mic. So you're missing out on those. The other thing is that I went really hard on the garlic aioli at the speakers' dinner last night, so I'm really sorry to any of you in the front row. I feel like you're probably going to be able to smell me, so sorry about that. I also discovered that a lot of you in this room are liars because I've been on Twitter this morning, and we're all embarrassed, aren't we? We're all embarrassed that we're still on Twitter, so none of us want to admit to it. I kind of went like that. So yeah, come find me later if you're still on Twitter, and we'll swap sob stories. So shall I give you a talk, maybe? So I'm going to be talking about systems of harm. For those of you who've got no idea who I am, why I'm rambling at you today, I'm Amy. As Vitaly said, I am a content design and design systems consultant based in the UK. And I am actually looking for work right now, so if you think that I know what I'm talking about, or you think I'm legit in the next 30 minutes, then come and find me afterwards. These are some of the design systems that I've worked on. So I've worked on design systems for gov.uk, for Babylon Health, which was a health tech company in the UK, for BT, which also includes EE and PlusNet, and most recently for Springer Nature. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how design systems can perpetuate and contribute to systemic harm. So I thought I'd just kick us off with a really nice light talk to start the day. And there's a couple of reasons that I want to talk to you about this. So as a design systems consultant, obviously I kind of hear and I do a lot of evangelizing about the benefits of design systems. So I'm used to kind of being brought in either during that sort of sales pitch time or shortly after it's been made, and they say, Amy, can you come and help us fulfill all of these promises we just made? And I say no. And I've noticed some patterns in the way that we tend to talk about the benefits of design systems. So broadly speaking, when we talk about why we need to have design systems, we tend to repeat these kind of three promises. So we talk about efficiency. We say that a design system will help us to reduce waste in our design and development processes and will help us to go faster. We talk about consistency. So we say that a design system will help us to standardize our digital product experiences, normally just digital. And then we talk about scale. So a design system will help us to scale our design systems across our digital product landscape. But this is the thing that we don't really ever say, especially not if we're in the business of selling design systems work, that none of this is actually inherently valuable. And if you did hear a noise just then, it was the sound of my career ending. It's fine. And you might be thinking, well, what is the point then? Why are we building design systems at all if none of this is valuable? But the important bit here is this word inherent. So it doesn't have any inherent value, right? So it doesn't mean that these things can't be really, really valuable if they're done in the right way. But it's worth being clear that efficiency is only really valuable if we're moving faster towards meaningful outcomes for the people using our products and our services. Consistency is only valuable if we are standardizing things to a good level of quality, right? So there's nothing worthwhile about consistently rubbish. And scaling things is only valuable if they are things that are actually worth reproducing. And although all of this might sound obvious, I say it because I've noticed a sort of shift in the conversation that I see happening around design systems recently, where we're starting to focus much, much more on the kind of artifacts and the mechanisms of our design systems, and really the kind of tooling and that side of things, really at the expense of the purpose and the reason that we're doing this work in the first place. So if we agree that there's actually no inherent value in the kind of added capability that we are bringing to the table with design systems, and so that efficiency, consistency, and the ability to scale, then the value has to lie instead with what we do with that capability. But this introduces a problem, right? Because if we can use our design systems to speed up meaningful work and to standardize things to a good level of quality and to scale the things that we do actually want to multiply across our products, then it means that we can also use our design systems to speed up problematic work and standardize things to a poor quality and scale things that we really shouldn't be reproducing. So in other words, not only is this work not inherently valuable, but it's also not inherently harmless. And that is something that I don't think we can ignore anymore. So to understand how design systems, I think, present a risk, let's look at how they work, just at the most basic level. So we create design systems by curating and then distributing a collection of components and patterns and content. And as product teams start using these systems to build websites and applications, these things start to get scaled across our digital landscape and occasionally beyond as they start to influence our kind of wider service offering, maybe other channels and things. But it's important to say again that these mechanisms that our design systems use to scale have no inherent value on their own unless they're used to scale things that we do actually want to reproduce. And what happens if they're not? So what happens if those components that we've built are inaccessible? Or if those patterns that we've built are discriminatory? Or if that content that we're asking people to use is exclusionary? What happens is that we create a system of harm. And we introduce we kind of industrialize discrimination, right? So we set up almost like this production line that lets us ship exclusion to the people who are using our services quickly, consistently, and at scale. And this has been really winding me up for the past couple of years. So a few months ago, I decided that I was going to make a podcast about it. I wanted to look at the ways in which design systems can perpetuate systemic harm and how we might mitigate that. So the podcast is called Systems of Harm, and if you'll indulge me, a shameless plug, it is available on all good podcast platforms. Do go and listen to it. So I interviewed 6 guests through the series, who I'll introduce you to as we go through this talk. You might recognize some of these faces. And I deliberately looked for people who I knew had experience of working on kind of with design systems, but also who had personal experiences of marginalization and discrimination. And what I really wanted to try and understand through these conversations is, if design systems can become these kind of vectors for systemic harm, then what can we do about it? So how can we instead build inclusive design systems that mitigate broader systems of harm? And through the conversations that I had, I've landed on 3 principles, which are to start with the teams who make design systems, to center stress cases, and to embrace complexity. So let's start with the first one, starting with the teams who make design systems. Now, of all of the kind of micro and macro decisions that we make when we are setting up our design systems and starting to develop and evolve them, the makeup of the team that we set up to create and maintain a design system seems to me to be the bit that gets kind of least attention. Like, it's kind of like if they have the right practical skills and experience, then, job done, let's hire them, let's get them to work. But that means that we're often not thinking kind of consciously about the perspectives and the knowledge and the biases that we feed into our design systems. So let's talk about bias for a minute. So every one of us makes thousands of big and small decisions every day. So even as I'm talking to you right now, I'm making decisions about where to look in the audience, about what to do with my hands. Seriously, what do we do with our hands? Does anyone else who speaks find that you get on stage and you're like, what do I do with my hands normally? Like where I'm going to stand and so on. And if I sat here and thought consciously about all of these decisions, I wouldn't be able to function well enough to give you this talk, right? So to cope with that, my brain is just making thousands of little unconscious decisions on autopilot based on my past personal experience about what I've done with my hands and what I've learned from those experiences. And all of these unconscious decisions form our cognitive biases. So in the first episode of Systems of Harm, I spoke to David Dylan Thomas, who, if you don't know him, has literally written a book on this subject. It's called Design for Cognitive Bias, and I really, really recommend it. It's brilliant. And one thing that he says is that we are not going to be able to switch off this autopilot, right? And we shouldn't try to, because we would just become completely inefficient. So he says that what we need to do instead is ask ourselves, which of these biases are harmful, and what are we going to do to try and counteract them and to mitigate against the harm that we might cause if we don't kind of keep them in check. And one way that we can do this is by counterbalancing our biases with other perspectives, so other biases. But this is really challenging right now, because if you hadn't noticed, and no offense, but I see it as I look around the room, like the tech industry has a real diversity problem. Our society, and therefore our organizations, even the more inclusive ones, are rife with inequality. It's why we have a persistent gender pay gap, right? It's why diversity within our industry continues to be seriously lacking, even though we hear year after year from companies that they know they need to do better. It's why in one design system team that I worked on, as a woman, I was outnumbered 4 times over just by men called Matt, right? Not a joke, not a joke. And it's surely why so many teams in the tech industry continue to look like this. You know, white, cis, non-disabled, pretty young. I really need to start paying these guys royalties. Honestly, I put them in like every one of my talks. I love them. Look at their little faces. They're so charming. The same guy? No. Just him and all his little mates. Anyway, it's really important to say that diversity is not inclusivity, right? They are not the same thing. Diversity is just variety. And aiming to recruit a diverse team without really thinking about creating an inclusive environment for that team to work in is a recipe for disaster. But if we don't have or we can't sustain a diverse team, it's a good indicator that the environment that we're working in is probably not very inclusive. And this becomes a self-perpetuating problem because it informs our biases about what tech teams should look like, right? So David talked about this when I spoke to him, and he said, when I say web developer, you probably picture a skinny white guy. And it's not because you think people who aren't skinny white guys can't be developers. It's literally just pattern recognition. And when it's unconscious, that's when it becomes dangerous to our hiring practices. So we hire teams that look like this, and then they hire more people that look like them, and then this has this kind of knock-on effect through our design systems. So when the team who creates and maintains our design system are biased towards a kind of narrow set of experiences, that bias then propagates through all of these layers of the people who end up interacting with our system. So it impacts our contributors, the people who work in our kind of wider organization, the people who use our design systems, and the people who who end up using our kind of products and services that those design systems are used to create. And the knowledge and experiences that we feed into our design systems then travel down through all of those layers and start reinforcing those biases out in the world. And you might be thinking, can't we just do user research? Like, can't we just test our products with a more diverse group of people and then verify that the decisions that we've made are the right ones and they're not going to exclude anyone? No. So no, we need to have a more representative set of people developing and creating our design systems and our products to balance that bias at the source. And that's because you can't just retrofit inclusion into your product, right? A lack of inclusion is not a bug that can be fixed after QA. User research can certainly help us to spot some issues, but by that point, we've usually kind of shaped our product and we've fed our design system with so much of our own bias that it's going to be really unrealistic to then go back and make really fundamental changes to what we've designed. And I don't know about you, but I've worked in so many organizations now where we do a round of user research and we find a ton of problems, and you go to the stakeholder and say, okay, we need a couple of weeks to fix this, and they go, no. So we need to be thinking about really kind of trying to catch these problems before they get into our design systems. And it's making sure that the kind of team that we're working on can do so with different kinds of knowledge. And I like to think about a concept here that was introduced to me by somebody called Kim Creighton, who is she does a lot of anti-racism work and education. And she talks about two types of knowledge. So the first kind is explicit knowledge. Now, this is the sort of knowledge that is really easy to articulate and codify and store, and can easily be transferred to another person. So in design system terms, this is probably like, how do you install this design system? How do you use this component? How do you configure it? That kind of thing. Then there's another kind of knowledge, which is tacit knowledge, which is much more complex. And tacit knowledge is developed through a person's lived experience, and it's much more difficult to transfer to another person by writing it down and verbalizing it. And people try, but it's just harder to kind of absorb that experience that they've had. And it's this second kind of knowledge that really allows us to kind of propagate our own experiences of biases through our design systems. And this is what determines the inclusivity of our products. So a strong example of this came from my guest in episode 4, who is a design systems designer and now design systems manager at Springer Nature, Fred Warburton. So I worked with Fred at Babylon a few years ago, and just before I'd met him, he was diagnosed at a pretty young age with a degenerative sight condition called retinitis pigmentosa, and he was told that he was losing his sight. And I worked with Fred at Babylon Health, and at that time, I watched him lead one of the most incredible pieces of accessibility advocacy and education work that I have ever seen. Really annoying, because he's just really young, really lovely, and really talented. And in this episode, Fred and I talked about the impact of having a disabled person leading this work and what that actually meant. And he said, you know, my situation, the fact that I was in my situation, made it much more tangible for people. So when he was going out and having these conversations with our stakeholders and asking them for funding and asking them to invest in this work, it's much more difficult for somebody to try and relate to accessibility stuff and kind of advocacy if you don't have an inclusive workforce that includes disabled people, because it's just sort of theoretical. You know, you're telling people to care about this stuff, but it's much harder to sit across from a human being who you know is going to be affected by these decisions and say no and shut that conversation down. I had a similar conversation with Imran Afzal, who is principal designer on the design system team at Co-op Digital. And Imran and I talked about design systems and racism and the impact of having an all-white team designing products and services. So he told me about a study that happened in 2020 that found that 5 out of 6 of the leading speech recognition software services were better at recognizing white people than people of any other ethnic background. And I'm going to go ahead and assume that nobody that was working on these systems kind of set out to exclude anybody. But this is just what happens when a team that isn't diverse builds systems. And I'm talking here about the kind of impact on the end users of these products and services, but it's worth noticing that this also really affects the people who end up working in the team itself. So what really struck me from talking to Imran is the amount of mental capacity that he has to dedicate to thinking about what it means for him to often be the only person of color working in an otherwise all-white design system team. And he said at some point during his career, he came to this realization that he was pretty much always the only person of color in the team, in many teams that he's worked in, and that the effect of this builds up over time. He feels like he has to work harder than his white colleagues to prove himself and to win people over. And I just couldn't help thinking, like, what if he could just dedicate all of that energy to his work, rather than having to think about this all the time? So my point is, I guess, if we're not building our design systems in an inclusive environment that supports participation from a diverse set of perspectives, then we can't design inclusive experiences. And that's because if we haven't experienced exclusion, then it's very hard to mitigate because we are much less likely to spot it until it's much later on. Now, I'm going to say now I'm absolutely not a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, and I'm not going to pretend to be, but I can see the impact of this. I can definitely see a correlation between the attention paid to inclusion in teams and organizations that I work with and the resulting kind of inclusivity of the products and services that they create. And we can't design inclusive experiences unless we address this. So now I'm going to move on to the second principle, which is to center stress cases. And what this means is centering the people who are most at risk of harm if we don't take them into consideration. Now, the term stress cases was coined by Erik Meyer and Sarah Wachter-Becher, who wrote this book, Designed for Real Life, which if you haven't read it, I would really recommend it. I expect a lot of you have. It's had a massive impact on how I tend to think about this stuff. And in the book, they say, real life is complicated. We might experience harassment or abuse. We might lose a loved one, become chronically ill. We might get into an accident. We might have a financial emergency, or simply just be vulnerable for not fitting into society's expectations. And historically, our industry has thought about these as edge cases, right? Because in theory, they only affect a small number of users. But in the book, Sarah and Erik propose redefining these situations not as edge cases, but as stress cases. So the moments that put our design choices and content choices to the test of real life. So instead of treating stressful situations as kind of fringe concerns and edge concerns that we can worry about later, we should actually move them to the front and center and start with the most vulnerable people and then work our way out to everybody else. So let's look at a specific example of this that comes from the book's co-author, Erik Meyer. Now, some of you might remember a few years ago that Facebook launched this feature called Your Year in Review. And it showed Facebook users the most important moment of their year, which was kind of based on the post of yours that got the most engagement. So the most likes, the most responses, the most comments. And the photos were accompanied by these kind of colorful graphics and this very tonally kind of celebratory content. And it was designed, I think it's fair to say, with a single context in mind, which is the person whose most liked photo was a happy memory that they were pleased to return to. But unfortunately, the feature made headlines for all the wrong reasons, which seem really predictable in hindsight. So Facebook received multiple complaints from people who experienced the feature as something much more painful and much more complex. And one of these people was Erik. So Erik's daughter had died earlier that year, and he had shared this news on Facebook. And for pretty obvious reasons, the post had received a lot of comments and a lot of engagement, and therefore it shot straight to the top of his year in review moment. And Erik wrote about this, and he said, yes, my year looked like that. True enough, my year looked like the now absent face of my little girl. And I'm sure a lot of people really enjoyed this feature, but is that engagement worth the pain of those who experienced it like this? Probably not. And this is why centering stress cases is so important. So another example comes from another one of my podcast guests who I spoke to, which is a content and UX writing consultant called Laura Parker. And she struggles with a condition called dyscalculia. Out of interest, just hands up if you've ever heard of dyscalculia. Okay, that's more than I thought. It's generally relatively unknown. And dyscalculia, for those of you that don't know, is a learning difference which is affecting kind of estimated about 1 in 20 adults in the UK. And it is characterized by a persistent difficulty with understanding numbers. Now, in episode 3 of Systems of Harm, Laura talked about how dyscalculia affects her everyday life. And she explained that while we often think of numbers as kind of neutral, almost clinical things, they are actually far from it. She explained that we can help people with low numeracy and dyscalculia by providing alternative formats to information presented as kind of numbers or tables or graphics. And design systems definitely have a real opportunity here to kind of guide the way that we do this in an inclusive way and to convey numerical information like tables and graphs and data by just kind of writing them out as plain content and things. Laura and a team of other designers working in the UK government have led a huge piece of research to understand how they can better serve people who struggle with numbers. And there is a blog post about it on the GovUK Design Notes blog. I've done a QR code because I'm technical. You can also just come and find me afterwards if you want to see this. This stuff is relatively easy to incorporate thoughtfully into our design systems, but we normally don't because we just don't tend to think about people who struggle with numbers as part of our audience, right? We think of them as sort of edge cases. And this has a real human impact. So Laura told me numbers are emotional. She told me to think about the importance of statistics when it comes to things like COVID-19 or climate change or inflation. And these are things that affect all of us in a really big way, right? So it can be really alienating if you struggle with numbers and you can't interpret what you're being told when it comes to things like this. And this really brings home for me why we need to center stress cases in our design systems. We have to start thinking first about those people who our design choices are most likely to harm. And it takes more time and effort to do this, for sure, but if we want to build inclusive products and services, starting with inclusive design systems, then we have to start thinking about the mess and the margins and the unintended outcomes of our decisions. And this leads me into our final design principle, which is embrace complexity. So this is actually a really interesting one for me because I have very much sold my services over the years on the basis of being really, really good at making things simple. So literally, if we take a look at my website, above the huge picture of my face, you will see it says, "Hello, I'm Amy. I am a content design and design systems consultant, making the case for simplicity and inclusion in the face of complexity." And this wording now gives me a kind of particular ick, because kind of making the podcast has left me with a really big question, which is, are simplicity and inclusion actually incompatible with each other? Which sounds like maybe a weird thing to say, so let me talk about how I got to this point. So as design system makers, we offer teams a really kind of simple way to create user experiences. That's often the promise. This is really easy. You can just use it out of the box. We've got accessibility baked in. You haven't. We give people these kind of reusable building blocks and guidelines and things to follow when they're developing things. But user experience is always an intersection of the products that we've designed and created and people's personal experiences and circumstances when they're using those products and services. And the thing about identity and circumstance is that they are always inherently complicated. So let's look at an example of a common form field that many design systems offer guidance for. What is your gender? And what we see here over and over again is these same buckets. So male first, obviously, not alphabetically, just first. Female, other. And it's that other that I find so problematic here. So a quick count through Wikipedia's gender page currently reveals 101 genders. Medicine site lists 72, and another website that I looked at lists 112. And I think the exact number is not really what's important here, but it's that it doesn't allow any of the users who identify in any other way than male or female to correctly identify themselves within our service. And beside the fact that we normally don't really need to ask this question at all, and beside the fact that asking it means that we're kind of collecting data in a way that reinforces a gender binary, there is a real human impact to this for the individual people who kind of encounter this question. So Luke was my podcast guest for episode 2. Luke is a design system advocate at Zero Height and is also trans non-binary. And they told me that when they encounter a field with only male and female options, they feel really unseen. And it's not a nice feeling, but it's a common one. It's very easy to think of these decisions as kind of relatively small and inconsequential. But when you think about how many times that a kind of trans or a non-binary person or somebody that falls outside of our kind of gender binary might encounter this question every day, you can quickly imagine the cumulative harm that this starts to do and how this starts to erode people's sense of identity. And this is just one of the ways that these kind of arbitrary choices that we make in our design systems can then scale to cause harm. So let's look at another one. Let's think about how we ask people for their name. Now, this is something that most design systems will cover. And it's something that most design systems offer kind of guidance on and might offer a pattern for. But when I think about how a lack of diversity in our industry shows up in our work, this is one of the first things that I think about. So this is a list of 40 false beliefs about names put together by Patrick McKenzie, and it's really worth a read if you haven't seen it before. We won't read it now because we'll be here all day. But when these false assumptions start to inform our design systems and our patterns for asking people for their names, that's when we start to exclude people. So Cheryl, who was my last podcast guest, she had a personal example of this. So Cheryl is an author, a lecturer, and chief design officer at a company called Substantial. And she's written a book called Closing the Loop, which is about systems thinking for designers. And she told me that her children have a double-barreled surname, but instead of a hyphen between the two parts of their surname, they have a space. And she said that there has never been a single healthcare system or service that could handle this. So every time Cheryl and her husband engage with a service that has stored their children's names, they have to try inputting various different permutations of those names in order to find the way that the system has stored it. So they have to enter both names, they have to try with a hyphen, and they have to try with a space. And it's just taking up kind of all this time. And it's also sending this message that, you know, we haven't accommodated you here. And Cheryl's experience is in no way unusual. So there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of this happening all over the internet. People get told over and over that their name is not valid because it doesn't conform to a particular set of validation rules that have been decided by somebody. And when I was collecting these examples from Twitter, the thing that people kept saying over and over again that really kind of struck me was, this is the story of my life. So when this happens to people over and over and over again, we're giving them a really clear message. This is not for you. This was not designed with you in mind. And then we have become, inadvertently probably, authors in that story of exclusion. And I've only touched on gender and names here, but in reality, our design systems cover much more than that. And when we don't design for this full human spectrum of characteristics and circumstances and experiences that our design systems need to serve, we're not just excluding people, we're actually erasing them. So we have to be willing to engage with the full complexity of the human experience in order to design systems that can effectively start to counter systemic harm. And at this point, you might be thinking, this all sounds a bit beyond the scope of a design system, doesn't it? Can't we just focus on shipping components and let product teams handle inclusion or something? No. So thinking about how our design systems perpetuate systemic harm is not a distraction from the work. It is the work. And if I can leave you with one thought today, it's this. Building an inclusive design system will make things harder, and it will slow you down. There aren't any silver bullets here today, because part of building an inclusive design system is reducing our speed to understand our impact. And nothing that I've shared today is a kind of quick, practical fix, but it is a direction of travel. I think it's really important that we start to balance the conversation about design systems and spend at least as much time thinking about the kind of human consequences and impact of the work that we're doing as we do thinking about the mechanics of our design systems and how we get our, design tool API to talk to our dev documentation. Please write documentation. So, the mechanisms that our design systems use will change over time because technology will change and our environment will change and our requirements will change and our expectations will change. But if we concentrate on human impact, then that provides us with a kind of consistent focus and will help us to weather this change and adapt our systems accordingly. And in the end, it is the only thing that really matters, because we can't know exactly what kind of challenges lie ahead in the world of design systems, and certainly not in the wider world. But we can choose what we center. We can choose to create inclusive design systems that put people at their heart. Even if it slows us down, we can choose to do it anyway. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. That was a very, very powerful talk. I think, it's very interesting. I think when I think about those issues, and by the way, dear friends, if you have any questions, please bring them in the smash.by/campfire, was it, right, for day one. I'm going to get them to them in a moment. I think one of the really interesting things that I note in many organizations is that very often we bring topics like inclusion, accessibility, diversity in a conversation to managers, or maybe even on the C-level. And very often you get this nodding or smiling, kind of this polite reaction. And I think that, at least in my experience, many of us are kind of mistaken maybe for approval or green light. But then once this happens, you bring up these topics and then you realize maybe 1 month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, nothing really changed. Maybe a little bit here and there. And so we need to be more actionable. We need to have timelines, we need to have actions, we need to have objectives, we need to have goals, we need to have accountability, we need to have governance and ownership, right? So I'm wondering, how would you kind of prompt change in an effective way? So an organization that's kind of really interested in making a change, but it's a little bit maybe slow in incorporating any changes, or feels like it's getting somewhere, but it really isn't. Where would you even start?
I think it's really hard. And in terms of both design systems work in general, and then when it comes to kind of wider pieces of work on inclusivity, whether that's accessibility or kind of other areas of inclusivity, I think, like you say, there's often a sort of in-principle agreement to do the work. And then when it comes to the reality of actually investing in it and getting the work done, that's when it can sometimes fall down. And I think there's a few things that probably have worked for me. So one of the things is actually something that David, who I interviewed on the podcast, talked about in the episode, which is to focus on risk over benefit, which maybe sounds a bit negative and a bit like something that a lot of people don't really want to do with their stakeholders. But one of our actual biases that we can use to our advantage is that people respond much more to risk. So if you talk about what's going to go wrong if you don't spend the time investing in this work and doing this work, people are much more likely to react to that, because as humans, we are designed to focus on risk and the possibility of negative consequences over the promise of something good happening. So I think that's one. And I think just also really kind of trying to be as clear as you can about at least what the first steps of the work are. So not just talking about the principle behind why it's important, but saying, this is what it actually looks like in practice. Right. And getting commitments from your stakeholders in terms of hiring a team. What size is that team going to be? How much is it going to cost? How long are they going to need to be in place for? What will happen after that period of time? What will they deliver? So that we're really talking about kind of tangible steps towards our goals and not just sort of theoretical aims.
Makes sense. There was a question that came from Sasha, kind of a personal question, I guess. In my experience, C-level managers simply don't care enough about accessibility and inclusion at all. How do they respond to your pitch? Do those kind of customers don't contact you in the first place?
I guess I probably don't attract a lot of clients who just don't care about that stuff at all, because I think I'm pretty clear when I kind of sell my services and talk about my work that is something that I am passionate about. So I suppose I'm lucky that I don't often get approached by people who don't care about this stuff. But I think I would suggest, I promise I'm not just here to plug my podcast. I'm not making any money from it, so it's only just for my own ego. But in the episode that I did with Fred Warburton, which I think was episode 4, we talked about selling the work of accessibility. And he talks in a lot of detail about kind of tailoring your message to different kinds of stakeholders. Because I think one thing that we often do is we go to all of our stakeholders with the same pitch. But actually his point was if you're working in finance, if you're working in legal, if you're working as a kind of head of product design, the thing that you care about, the thing that's going to make you care about accessibility is probably going to be slightly different for all those people. You know, legal people are going to care much more about people getting litigious and being sued and that sort of thing, the risk there. People working in finance are probably going to care about how much it's going to cost and what the benefits will be. People working in product design may care more about, you know, the kind of usability of our products and things. So I think it's about sort of trying to engage with that audience in a way that will make sense to them. And also, I said it in the talk, but I think just like the power of actually hiring people who have lived experience of this. It's so much harder to sit opposite somebody like Fred, for example, and say, oh, you know, we just don't think we're going to spend the money on like making this work for a screen reader when you know he's going to need that in like 2 years' time. I
think it's also something that I noticed where whenever you get people with disabilities working in the company, or you do some accessibility testing, all of a sudden that really changed the entire culture. It kind of slowly starts changing the entire culture. That's actually quite impressive. Many more questions that came up as well. Regarding, Sasha is wondering, Sasha was already up. Mathieu is wondering, when using a design system which is lacking in accessibility features, it is tempting to simply disregard it to create custom, alternative solutions addressing the issues in the lacking components? Should consistency and scale be compromised in this way for the sake of avoiding harm?
So I think if I've understood that question correctly, it's about should we try and make things more accessible at a product level if the system is introducing accessibility issues? Absolutely. I think that certainly, like, I'm not a believer that like if there's a design system, you have to use it, you know, against all better judgment. So if the design system is not serving that need and is introducing accessibility problems, then absolutely I would advocate like making things more accessible at a product level. But I think I would encourage those teams to try and work with the design system team to make the core design system offering more accessible. And I think the way that I like to think about this kind of work is like it's almost like a contract between the product team and the design system team. Like I kind of mentioned in the talk, when people talk about, oh, you know, our components are all fully accessible and we've baked accessibility in, so you don't even have to think about it. Like, that's just a lie, because you can create really inaccessible experiences using really accessible components if they're not put together in the right way, if they're not accessibility tested at a local product level. And so I think it's about being really clear about where the division of responsibility lies between product teams and design system teams when it comes to making accessible user experiences. So I would certainly say, like, if the design system team is not fulfilling its duty in that respect, then try to work with them to get that to be changed.
Makes sense. Julian is wondering, are design systems just superconductors for good and bad practices? You were usually talking about them, but the underlying issues in our industry are there. I think it's more just a statement than a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think in many ways, design systems are not necessarily, we cannot say that, in many ways, we're creating the system that is supposed to scale and go kind of where we can build other things with it. And so if it's inherently has some bad practices or insufficiently good practices, I would say, embedded in it, then we're going to end up with the same result, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely fair to say, like, design systems do not cause all systemic harm, and they definitely can't remove it all. But I think that they contribute to it and they can mitigate it. And I think that that's what they should try to do. And sometimes that will be easy if you work in an organization that really supports inclusivity and accessibility. You'll find that a lot less full of friction. If you work in an organization that doesn't support those things, you're going to be having an uphill battle. But I still think it's worth doing.
We have 2.5 more minutes. Michael is wondering, I think this is also an interesting one. Are there any studies or research on how systems affect users without proper considerations of policies? Do users who encounter, let's say, this only male-female option, do they avoid such systems, or do we have any data about that so we can make a business case on that?
I'm sure there have been lots of studies about this, and I guess it kind of depends on the service. Like, I've worked on a lot of government services where you couldn't just skirt around a question or not engage with it because it's the government, right? So there's no alternative to government. You just have to battle your way through it, even if it's not inclusive for you. There's definitely, like in the UK government anyway, there's been lots of studies on like failure demand and how when we don't design forms that can accommodate people's experiences or their name or their identity or other sort of characteristics about them, what happens is people drop out of the digital service and end up going to like more in-person channels like the telephone or something, and that's much more costly, and that's something that we definitely kind of want to get away from. So I definitely think there's some information and some data on how forms and digital services that aren't inclusive contribute to kind of failure demand.
Yep.
And I could probably dig some out. I don't have them on the top of my mind.
Because I remember there was, I think, an article maybe 3 years ago or so came up where there was a service, I think it was, I don't remember where it was, I think in Italy, if I'm not mistaken, where there was a digital service and you could either call somebody to ask to kind of submit, to ask a question or make an appointment or something, or you could fill in an email, fill in the contact form. There was no email that you could use, and in that contact form, of course, you had CAPTCHA, and that was one of the really horrible ones. I mean, CAPTCHAs are horrible by default, I would say. We could make it as a statement, but there were some which was really from out of the world, and so the person couldn't really solve the CAPTCHA, but also was deaf. So couldn't call either. So what do you do then? So this is like, especially if you're like in a public organization or public institution, this is just totally not okay.
Yeah.
Right? And there are plenty of examples of that. And I think one question that also comes here, just to finish the thought here too, is so how do you actually sell it well? So how do you sell inclusive decisions well? How do you sell accessibility well? I mean, obviously, we need to think about bringing people in, right? Hiring people more inclusively, but it's also taking time. So what can you do to make changes relatively quickly without waiting for, I don't know, months and years for something to change?
I just think the reality is it depends what's motivating the people that you have to sell it to. And if people are not interested in inclusivity and accessibility, it is like the reality is it's going to take a long time to change those mindsets. I think the thing that I've seen be most effective is kind of effective storytelling. So really kind of bringing the human impact to life, whether that's through showing like videos of user research happening, including like first-person testimonials or bits of feedback and things like that. And also looking at data, like it is, there was quite an interesting piece of work done last year by an organisation called Scope, which is a disability advocacy charity in the UK, who looked at the kind of commercial impact of inaccessible products and how much like the kind of monetary loss, basically, when disabled customers take their business elsewhere because it's not, the experience they're being offered is not accessible. And it was really staggering. Like I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but they give a figure for like, this is the kind of spending power of disabled people in the UK that we are losing out on if we're not serving them properly with our products and services. So I think it's a combination of maybe some of those slightly more cynical tactics where you're saying like, this is how much it's physically costing us, this is how much we're at risk of being sued, this is all those things, and then also really trying to show people the human impact of it as well as best you can.
Right, makes sense. Well, if you have more questions to Amy, we always kindly ask our speakers to join the fireplace where there is a Lego stuff as well. So you can also just come directly to Amy and ask more questions. We have a lot more here, but we are running out of time. So thank you so much for being with us, Amy.